Hi, everybody. So I'm going to hit on a couple of items first, theatrical genres and forms, before I launch into a sort of discussion of musical theater and the American musical as a form. So theatrical genres and forms want to sort of first unpack this idea of what is a form. Well, it's really just the shape or the particular purpose that something has been made, the structure, and it might include a little bit of style, but it's really this category. It's a French word for kind or type. So in theater, the different forms that we typically label plays include tragedy, comedy, tragicomedy, melodrama, farce. I would also include musical comedy, musical theater, and even postmodern performance into these different genres. Today, it's getting more and more difficult to label plays in these distinct categories because playwrights really aren't sticking to just one form and might be mixing into a sort of hybrid form and not following these sort of discrete categories of either tragedy or comedy or even tragicomedy. So moving on, sort of looking at the background of tragedy, we can consider it one of the oldest forms of theater, at least from a Western perspective. So this is really thinking about that the ancient Greeks gave us this form of tragedy within our sort of Western perspective. I'm saying that because theater certainly had other forms in other countries such as India and China that wouldn't be categorized into tragedy or comedy in the same way. And we get these terms, tragedy and comedy, really from Aristotle writing about the previous ancient Greek theater. So tragedy is typically serious in nature, but it can contain comic moments, and it usually is exploring the human condition through some sort of ideology or morality, looking at relationships between people. And as a form, certainly the height of it was a category in ancient Greek theater, but also Elizabethan theater. We think about Shakespeare's tragedies, that it has a specific kind of structure. In terms of comedy, again, we can also find this form coming out of ancient Greek theater, or at least this Aristotelian Western perspective of form of theater. And in comedy, we see that there's deviations from normality, and that certainly influencing a sort of character type as well as the plot. The comedy is fun, it can be satirical, and typically is a plot surrounding some sort of situation, this idea of situational comedy. Now, I want to speak a little bit to how comedy is definitely specific to culture. And what may have been funny to the Greeks or even to the Romans is not necessarily funny today. When you read a Roman comedy, the plot structure usually revolves around rape or incest or, other things like that. And that just isn't a subject that would be of comedy, of a comic nature today, unless it's really about mistaken identity. And certainly Shakespeare wrote many of his comedies with that as a background, this idea of mistaken identities or using twins as a motif, as a device. So in tragicomedy, we have both a serious subject, but the overall story ends happily. So this is a combination of tragedy and comedy. And in farce, we typically see with, say, British farce and French farce that is fast-paced and that it includes physical comedy that is slapstick as opposed to comedy of language. And the characters are exaggerated, and typically we find that the plots are improbable, or at least the situations that the characters find them in. And that's some of the elements of farce. Now, another genre is melodrama, which was a quite a popular form in 19th century, and the term melodrama just simply means song drama. Not that the play was actually sung, but that music underscored things. And so in melodrama, we have these very clear characters of good and bad, or the hero as good and the villain as bad, and that there's this clear definition of morality. So obviously the villain is the one who is trespassing against that social morality. So style in theater really is referring more to how a play is presented, so the method of presentation. And style can be influenced anything from the culture in which the play is coming out of, or the nation, so that sort of ethnicity of both the playwright or the production itself, the time period of when a play is being produced. So if you're seeing a play that was produced, maybe we have film footage of a Shakespearean play from the 1940s, is going to look very different than a Shakespeare play from the 1960s. Then also the aesthetics that are popular at the time, or the aesthetics that are being chosen by the designers and the director. Popular culture can influence the style of a play, and even how the playwright is writing at that moment. You think about a very celebrated playwright, Annie Baker, who has won a Pulitzer for her work, and one of her plays, The Flick, which takes place in a movie theater, but it's after the movie, and the people who work in the movie theater are cleaning up and having this conversation. So that play is very much a sort of part of everyday, ordinary culture that is reflective of a contemporary now. And then other elements, like the company itself, might influence what that style of theater is. Mabu Mines, for instance, when we saw Doll's House, both the director as an auteur director, but also the company is sort of famous for how it approaches plays in terms of style. And certainly there's a number of other companies that have that sort of very overt stylizing of plays. And then the way in which a play is presented can sometimes come down to just what the truth of the script is, and in other words, what the playwright is meaning, how the director interprets the play in order to make that play be true to what the playwright intended. And one example would be something like Waiting for Godot, Samuel Beckett's work. He very specifically, had ideas about his plays that you don't cross gender caste. So you rarely, if ever, because they would be illegal, because his estate controls very much the productions, that the characters, say in Waiting for Godot, are always played by men. So that's certainly the truth of that play. And then the value of the script, or is the script worth producing, and should it be produced in a particular style because of the message? So does it make sense to take something like the Laramie Project, which is a documentary piece, as a genre form, that it was written and developed and originally performed in this sort of documentary style of theater? It wouldn't make sense to take high production values and put a sort of veneer on that play, because it was really coming out of this idea that the newspaper and the newscast and the stories, and that the company members are shifting from character to character. So they play like 200 characters in this play, but there's only about 9 company members. And in order to do that, they just simply shift a simple, jacket, simple costume piece, a hat, or a collar, and a simple prop, or rearrange chairs in a certain way. And so this idea that the magic of theater is happening in your imagination, but it's really about the story and the verbatim, meaning the words that these artists went to Laramie and recorded. That's what the play's about. It's not about presenting an illusion or spectacle. It's presenting this sort of record of events so that the audience can maybe make their own judgment or question how something like that could have happened in a community that didn't understand itself, or how hate can fester and then manifest. So that's certainly one example of how the manner of expression of the style of a play can be influenced by really the truth of the script. And then, of course, production values. Production values just simply mean, how slick, how much money is spent, how much something looks bling bling in a sense. And Wicked would certainly be an example of something with high production values, or even The Lion King would certainly be an example of something with high production values. It's not to say that shows with low production values are less than. It just simply means that there was more produced, more money was raised and put into a design effort. So that sort of wraps up this idea of genres, but I want to move on to musical theater, because certainly musical theater is its own genre, but has its own subset of genres. So musical theater could be considered really an American form. And what I mean by that is that when we think of musical theater today, it was very much manifested and blossomed on Broadway, so in the US. Now, it was influenced by other forms. So it has its roots in other, both American forms, but also European forms, everything from Italian opera to plays that had song and dance, singing and dancing and acting all merged together, but also other American forms like 19th century minstrelsy, which is blackface, vaudeville, burlesque, and Yiddish theater. So American, or not even just American musicals, but musical theater in general can be placed into different categories. Just like we looked at theatrical genres, there are forms within musical theater. So there's operetta, musical comedy, musical theater, which isn't necessarily comedy, and then revues. And each one of these have their own specific structure. So a revue is just that. It's a series of songs that aren't necessarily tied together with plot. And then an operetta is going to be sung and not spoken, so there's no dialogue or very little. So there's not a book associated with the musical. And then musical comedy is obviously a musical that is comic, thinking about something like Legally Blonde or 9 to 5 or Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum. Those are all musical comedies. But then musical theater really is a larger, broader category that's going to be, a catch-all that's catching all these other musicals that wouldn't necessarily be placed in musical comedy. So those are sort of the types or forms within musical theater. So this history of vaudeville and burlesque as influence, a very strong influence on early American musical theater, comes out of what vaudeville actually was composed of. And so vaudeville shows would consist of dramatic sketches, songs, variety acts. They could even have, these spectacles of jugglers or acrobatics, or animal acts, all of these kinds of spectacles. And none of these skits were connected. They were all different skits that you would watch, and there might be the headliner with the subcategories of performers, but there was nothing to connect the evening together. And then, of course, burlesque is a little bit of these same idea as vaudeville, that there were skits and acts, but it really was striptease, or moved into striptease. And if you want to know more about that history of burlesque, Stephen Sondheim's musical Gypsy is a great history of the sort of the death of vaudeville and the sort of birth of burlesque during this sort of the Great Depression, and how these theaters that were these great spaces where vaudeville happened became burlesque houses, or houses of ill repute in a sense. But obviously there's a resurgence of burlesque and a sort of neo-burlesque. And both of these forms influenced early American musicals. So this other form I was talking about, blackface or minstrelsy, so like the traveling minstrel, these were troupes of actors/musicians, and they were both white performers, white troupes, and black performers, black troupes. And it was a very popular form in 19th century America. And these troupes would travel all over the U.S. and make a living. And yes, even these black performers performing in blackface. So while this idea of blackface is quite racist in the sense that it presents a stereotype of a black person in 19th century America, black performers were able to capitalize on this sort of stock character and create skits and create music and make a living traveling as a troupe of actors. Spike Lee has a great film called Bamboozled that has some really interesting political undertones as well as satire about blackface. So if you ever get a chance to see that film, I think it's a really brilliant film. Other influences, so we have vaudeville, burlesque, minstrelsy. We even a little bit of melodrama influenced. And so what manifests in early Broadway, a lot of revues and musical sort of song and dance. But George M. Cohan, who was producing musical shows, actually is credited with sort of developing the idea of the book. So the book is the part of musical theater that connects the songs, that gives the characters actual plot and intention, you could say intention and objective, and bridges these gaps between the music and the dance and dialogue. Because prior to this, we really just have songs and dance and they sort of vaudeville or revue as a sort of standard structure. If you know the song Give My Regards to Broadway or Yankee Doodle Dandy, these were all hits that came out of the musical Little Johnny Jones. And one of the things that Cohan is credited with is a sort of creating this down-to-earth dialogue, this sort of realism within the musical. And he created over 50 musicals in this early period. So this idea of a structure to the American musical really comes out of this form of that there are not just individuals, but artists who are working on these areas of the musical, the book, the lyrics, and the music. And so we see this sort of development of teams of artists doing that. And so the book is literally this story part, the dialogue, but it's also the plot. And the person who writes the book is the librettist. And then the lyrics, which are the song lyrics, are created by the lyricist. And then the music is created by the composer. Now, sometimes the composer also creates the lyrics. Sometimes the librettist does lyrics and book. So it just depends on the collaboration. But typically, you'll see the credit for all three of those three things: book, music, and lyrics. So this idea of tracing characters through the entire play is really important to this form, as opposed to a review where the characters might not, have anything to do with each other because it's just from skit to song to skit or whatever. So the 1920s and 30s, we have a development of these musical comedies that have songs that become quite famous and become what are called standards. So this idea of Irving Berlin's songs or Jerome Kern or the Gershwins. And what was unique about what they were doing was the sophistication of lyrics and modulations to the music itself. So these intricate and clever rhymes that also connected to character and to character development. So that sort of paved the way for the next era in the 1930s and 40s with Oscar Hammerstein, who adapts the book about the Mississippi River and this showboat and this play musical opening in 1927, which then became a famous film also. Old Man River, that's a famous song from that musical. And then the Gershwins actually won a Pulitzer for their musical of Thee I Sing. And then we have in 1935 a very famous musical, Porgy and Bess, which some argue is actually an operetta. But the Gershwins obviously working on that. And if you notice that we have a team on the lyrics and then one person doing the book and then one person doing the music. So the 1940s and 50s is really sort of known as the golden era of Broadway. And this is when Richard Rodgers teams up with Oscar Hammerstein and have hit after hit after hit. So we have Oklahoma in 1943, we have Carousel 1945, South Pacific 1949, The King and I 1951, and then Sound of Music 1959. And really those musicals follow that tradition of book, lyrics, music, and strong plot, characters that you can trace through the entire play. And so what's interesting is then the 1960s, so we mark 1964 with Fiddler on the Roof as the end of the golden era, as sort of like the last great musical. And that's because if you think about what was happening in the 1960s with civil rights and a sort of youth culture revolution and anti-establishment and the influence of rock and roll, that Hair comes in as in 1967, not just as a concept musical, but as a rock musical. And here is this play that is disjointed, it's experimental, it is loosely arranged around an idea or characters or places, and it changes Broadway forever. And so here's an example of the original film poster, the play poster, and it became a movie a few years later after being on Broadway. The movie, it kind of deviates from the play. And I know that just because I did a production of it in college. And the film is definitely worth seeing, but it almost, because of the nature of film, pulls it together into a more cohesive story than the actual play, which is really very just loosely pulled together by song after song after song. So there's more story in the film. Then we have in 1970, we have Stephen Sondheim, who had been collaborating already with Oscar Hammerstein and even Jerome Kern. But he writes in 1970 his concept musical, or his first one, Company, which loosely revolves around a bachelor in an apartment building in New York City, and all the other characters somehow connected to this one character, but that's basically what the play is about. So it is indicative of how things were changing on Broadway. Now, Stephen Sondheim is, in a sense, one of the most influential artists in American musical history. And if we just look at the canon of his work, you can see hit after hit after hit, and some amazing musicals. Some not so, some were flops, but others are part of a sort of what almost many high schools, many colleges, and certainly community theaters and professional theaters. And we have reboots of multiple Sondheim pieces. So I'm just going to go through these, and these are in alphabetical order, not necessarily, they're not in chronological. So Anyone Can Whistle, Assassins, Candide, Company, Do I Hear a Waltz, Evening Primrose, Follies, The Frogs, A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum, Gypsy, Into the Woods, recently done as a film, right? Little Night Music, Marry Me a Little, Merrily We Roll Along, Pacific Overtures, Passion, Putting It Together, Roadshow, Saturday Night, Side by Side by Sondheim, which is a review, Sondheim on Sondheim, another review, Sunday in the Park with George, a great play about the Impressionist painter Georges Seurat, Sweeney Todd, the Demon Barber of Fleet Street, also made into a film with Johnny Depp, West Side Story, also made into a film. You're gonna love Tomorrow. So that sort of wraps up musical theater. And while I concentrated on talking about it as an American form, I also want to emphasize that the West End in London is, as influential on musical theater. And so I've posted 9-part series on the West End musical theater, but you might enjoy it if you like musicals. And it certainly has many U.S. or American artists also interviewed in the process of sort of looking at some of the major musicals that came out of the West End, mostly influenced by Andrew Lloyd Webber, Jesus Christ Superstar, Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor, Phantom, Les Mis. Not that that's a Andrew Lloyd Webber, but there are a lot of musicals that are part of a sort of larger canon of musical theater that are certainly came out of England. And on later this week, we'll be looking at design theory, but specifically I'll be using Hairspray as the sort of object of study. And so sort of tying together both looking at it as a musical, but also looking at some of the design ideas behind costuming in Hairspray. All right. See you soon.